The year was 1874. The frontier was wild, the towns lawless, and a man could either die poor, or marry strange. When Elijah Graves accepted $500 to wed a woman he'd never met, he thought it was just another poor soul desperate for security. But when she removed her bonnet on their wedding night, he didn't speak. He couldn't. Because what he saw wasn't human, or maybe it was worse, a secret he wasn't meant to uncover. If you think this is just another love story, you're wrong. Stay with me until the end to discover why this marriage was never about love, and why Elijah was the last man anyone ever heard from again. The sun beat down on Dry Creek like it held a grudge. Dust swirled in lazy circles across the dirt road, coating the boots of those who dared walk it. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and sweat, the scent of stale whiskey clinging to every creaking beam. Elijah Graves sat hunched at the end of the bar, his hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the glass in front of him. It was the only drink he could afford that day, and even that came with the barkeep's warning that he was running a tab no one was keen to let grow. Elijah looked the part of a man who'd wrestled with God and lost. The lines on his face were carved deep, like the canyons beyond the ranch he could no longer call his. Once, his hands had built fences and branded calves. Now they trembled as he lifted the glass. The bank had sent its final notice that morning, and the idea of returning to a home already claimed by vultures made the whiskey taste like ash. The door creaked open behind him. Elijah didn't turn at first, not until he heard the soft, deliberate footfalls that followed. Slow, measured, like someone who wasn't used to being hurried. A hush spread through the room the way it does when someone important, or dangerous, walks in. A tall man dressed in black from boots to hat, stopped beside Elijah's stool. "You're Elijah Graves?" the man asked, voice as smooth as river stone. Elijah glanced up. The stranger's face was pale, sharp, eyes the color of smoke. "Depends who's asking." The man slid a leather pouch onto the bar with a dull thud. The weight of it spoke louder than words, coins, real silver or gold, not paper promises. "I represent someone who's in need of a reliable husband. Someone quiet. Desperate might help." Elijah's jaw tensed. "That's so." "Yes," the man said, folding his gloved hands neatly on the bar. "She requires protection. In name only. You'll be compensated. $500, up front." Elijah blinked. $500. Enough to buy back the ranch, feed the horses, maybe even start over. It didn't make sense. Nothing did in that moment except the way his heart pounded in his ears. "And what's the catch?" he asked, voice rough from dust and doubt. "No questions," the man replied. "You take the money. You marry her. You ride out by sundown. That's all." Elijah studied the man's face, looking for the lie. But there was none, or maybe it was so deeply buried that only a fool would dig for it. "Why me?" The stranger smiled faintly. "Because you've got nothing left to lose. And she's not the kind of woman who needs affection. Just shelter from certain entanglements." It should have set off alarm bells. And maybe it did. But desperation has a way of silencing a man's better judgment. Elijah glanced toward the window where the sun had begun its slow crawl down the sky. "Where is she?" "She'll meet you at the chapel by the East Ridge. There's a preacher waiting. All you need to do is say, 'I do.'" Elijah stared at the pouch. He reached for it, hesitated. "What's her name?" The man in black didn't blink. "Names or questions? You said you wouldn't ask." Elijah clenched his jaw. This was madness. It reeked of secrets and buried trouble. But when he closed his eyes, he saw the dying porch swing of his family's ranch, the barn doors sagging, the dry fields begging for rain that wouldn't come. He saw his mother's grave and his father's empty chair. He opened his eyes, picked up the pouch. It was heavier than it looked. "I'll be there," he said. The man tipped his hat. "Good. She'll be wearing a white bonnet. Don't speak to her till after the vows." And with that, the man turned and walked out, leaving behind silence and the smell of dust. Elijah didn't move for a long while. He sat with the money in his hand, the weight of it anchoring him to the barstool like a man already tied to his fate. By late afternoon he was back in his room at the boarding house, shaving with water so cold it burned. He put on his cleanest shirt, still wrinkled but less stained than the others, and tied the biolo his mother had made. It felt wrong dressing up for something he didn't understand, but what was there to lose now? His dignity had gone the way of his livestock. As the hour neared sundown, Elijah rode out to the ridge, past dry fields and broken fences, the wind whipping through golden grass like it knew something he didn't. The chapel stood quiet on the hill, weathered but standing just like him. An old preacher stood outside with a book in his hands and a look that said he didn't care for questions either. And then she stepped out from the shadows. She wore a plain white dress and a bonnet tied tight beneath her chin. Her hands were folded, gloved. She moved like a ghost, slow, measured, silent. Elijah tried to look at her face, but the bonnet's brim cast a deep shadow. He saw only the curve of her jaw, pale skin, and something unreadable in the way she held herself, like a prisoner pretending to be a bride. The preacher cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" Elijah hesitated only a moment, then stepped forward. "Yes," he said. "Let's get on with it." And just like that, Elijah Graves, broken cowboy of Dry Creek, married a stranger for $500, and sealed a deal he would come to regret more deeply than he could ever imagine. The old clapboard church stood at the edge of town like a forgotten relic, its paint peeling, its bell tower silent, and its windows thick with dust that turned daylight into something dim and uncertain. Elijah Graves stepped through its creaking door, his boots echoing against the wooden floorboards. The air inside was stale, heavy with incense long since faded, and the scent of dried flowers left behind from weddings no one remembered. He had married once before, years ago when hope had still lived on his land, but this was something else entirely. This was business. A transaction. And yet, something about it felt like a noose tightening. At the altar stood the preacher, ancient and slumped, his white collar crooked as if he'd given up correcting it years ago. To Elijah's left, the man in black, the one who had made the offer, nodded toward the door. It creaked open and in stepped the bride. She moved slowly, her boots muffled against the wooden floor. Her dress was clean but plain, cream-colored linen without lace or frill. A deep bonnet veiled her face in shadow, tied so tight beneath her chin that Elijah couldn't see her mouth, her jaw, or even her eyes. She clutched a bouquet of dried sage and prairie grass, not flowers. There was no music, no witness, no smile. Elijah cleared his throat and offered a respectful nod, but she didn't return it. He glanced at the man in black again. Was this some sort of joke? But the man only gestured for the ceremony to begin. The preacher opened a weather-worn Bible, his voice scratchy as he read the vows like he'd forgotten what they meant. Elijah said, "I do," with a dry mouth and a pounding in his ears. The woman said, "Nothing." She only nodded once, barely, and signed her name on the marriage ledger as Annabelle. Her handwriting was small and neat, but there was a trembling to it. They didn't kiss. Elijah didn't even try. Outside, the sun was dipping behind the hills, staining the sky in shades of fire and rust. The man in black handed Elijah the promised $500, then walked away without another word. Elijah tucked the cash into his saddlebag, his fingers trembling slightly as he did. He turned to Annabelle, who stood quietly beside a roan mare, hands folded, bonnet still tied tight. He offered to help her mount. She refused with a shake of her head and climbed up herself, riding with eerie stillness. The journey back to the ranch was long, and the prairie wind howled like a widow through the sagebrush. Elijah tried once, just once, to spark conversation. "So, Annabelle is it?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "You from around these parts?" She said nothing. He tried again after a while. "You all right back there?" Still nothing. Not even a nod. He looked over his shoulder a few times during the ride. She sat tall in the saddle, posture perfect, hands steady on the reins. But the moonlight did something strange as it spilled over her frame. Elijah couldn't put a finger on it at first. Then halfway down a narrow trail he saw it, her shadow. It was moving a split second out of sync. When her head turned left, the shadow twitched right. When her hand reached up to adjust the bonnet, the shadow lagged behind like a delayed echo. Elijah blinked, rubbed his eyes and looked again. But the shadow had corrected itself. He laughed under his breath, trying to shake off the chill crawling up his spine. "Too much whiskey," he muttered. They arrived at the ranch just after midnight. Elijah's land looked like a ghost of what it had once been. Fences sagging, barn door hanging off one hinge, the fields overrun with wild grass. He dismounted and gestured toward the house. "It ain't much," he said, forcing a smile, "but it's home. I'll sleep in the barn if you want the bed." Annabelle said nothing. She followed him to the porch, footsteps quiet but deliberate. Inside, she took off her gloves and set them gently on the table. Elijah watched as she moved with careful precision, like each motion had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Still, she did not remove the bonnet. He tried once more. "Look, I don't know what arrangement you had with that fella, but I figure we're both in a bind. You don't gotta talk if you don't want to. Just know I won't hurt you. You're safe here." Annabelle slowly turned her head toward him. For a moment, Elijah thought he saw the edge of her face inside the bonnet. Pale, motionless. But it was hard to tell. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small silver locket, and placed it silently on the mantel. Then, without a word, she climbed the stairs and disappeared into the bedroom. Elijah stood in the parlor for a long time after that, staring at the locket. He didn't open it. Didn't dare. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the window panes like a whisper from the hills. And somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. But she hadn't moved. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't sleep that night. By the time Elijah Graves guided his horse up the dry, sloping trail to his ranch, the moon had risen above the ridgeline, casting a pale shimmer over the desolate landscape. The familiar outline of his weather-beaten house stood quiet and tired, like an old dog watching its master return after a long absence. The ride back had been silent, with Annabelle perched behind him, bonnet still pulled low, hands clutching his coat, not out of closeness he sensed, but as a tether to something she didn't want to let go of. Her grip hadn't loosened once. Now, standing beside the porch, she stared at the front door as if it were a mouth about to swallow her whole. Elijah dismounted and offered her a hand, but she stepped back, shaking her head gently. He frowned. "It's just the door, Annabelle," he said, trying to make his voice lighter than the growing weight in his gut. She didn't respond. Instead, she looked past the house toward the side where the cellar sat half dug into the earth. Without a word, she walked around the porch and disappeared into the darkness. Puzzled and unnerved, Elijah followed. He found her standing before the cellar door, silent and still as if she'd always belonged there. She didn't ask him to open it. She didn't need to. He retrieved the rusty key from his pocket and slid it into the latch, the lock groaning open with a sound that reminded him of something old and long forgotten. When the heavy wooden door creaked aside, Annabelle finally moved, descending the stone steps into the earth like a memory returning to its grave. Inside, the air was cool and stale, laced with dust and a hint of iron. Annabelle said nothing. She moved like she knew the space, her steps light but deliberate. Elijah lit the oil lamp that hung from a nail on the wall, casting golden light across the stone walls. She remained near the back, half in shadow, her face still hidden by the bonnet. "This ain't exactly the bridal suite," Elijah joked, trying to cut the tension. But she offered no smile, no reply, just a subtle shake of the head as if she'd heard the line before too many times. Eventually they made their way into the house through the kitchen door. She walked behind him, her footfalls unnervingly quiet on the old floorboards. Elijah led her upstairs, intending to show her the main bedroom, but she stopped short outside the attic door. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached for the doorknob and turned it herself. "You don't want to sleep in a proper bed?" Elijah asked, confused. Annabelle didn't answer. She opened the attic and ascended the narrow staircase without a glance back. Elijah stood there baffled. He waited for her to reappear. She didn't. Minutes passed before he climbed the steps halfway, pausing at the top to glance into the low-ceilinged room. She'd already begun unpacking what little she had, just one small bag, and was unfolding a dark, heavy cloth. Without a word, she began tacking the fabric over the attic's narrow window. The moonlight vanished as the cloth blocked it out completely. "You don't like light?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Again she gave no reply. Elijah noted how carefully she covered the entire window, smoothing down the edges as though sealing something in, or out. When she was done, she turned away from the light and sat cross-legged on the floor, hands folded neatly in her lap. He tried to smile. "Well, if you need anything, I'll be downstairs." She nodded once. Just once. As the days passed, Elijah found himself growing more unsettled. Annabelle rarely left the attic during the day. If she did, it was only to walk quietly through the halls at night. She avoided mirrors, covered every reflective surface with cloth, and never stepped into any room unless he entered first. She ate little, never more than a few bites, and only when the sun had gone down. One morning, Elijah returned from the barn and found every window in the house covered. Every curtain drawn, every gap stuffed with rags or pinned fabric. It was as if she couldn't bear the outside world looking in, or perhaps feared what she might see looking out. The cellar too had changed. She kept going back there. He'd find her sitting on the bottom step, whispering softly to herself, words he couldn't quite hear. Once, when he approached quietly, he thought he caught the name Eleanor repeated again and again, like a prayer, or a warning. Still, Elijah forced himself to believe it was all just a matter of strangeness. Maybe she'd come from a strict upbringing. Maybe she was touched in the head. Maybe trauma had left her damaged and silent. He'd known plenty of folks who acted off because the world had been cruel to them. Who was he to judge? But then came the incident with the mirror. One evening, while checking a crack in the barn window, Elijah passed by the hallway mirror he kept by the stairs. In it he caught a glimpse of something off. Annabelle had just walked past behind him, but her reflection hadn't. She was there in the hallway but not in the mirror. The glass showed only him standing alone. He blinked, turned quickly and saw her at the far end of the hall, already climbing the attic steps again. He rushed to the mirror and stared into it, waiting. Nothing. His heart hammered. That moment cracked something inside him. He no longer could dismiss the strange behavior as merely different. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. He could feel it crawling along the walls, creeping through the silence of his home, threading itself through the attic, the cellar, and now his own thoughts. But he kept it buried. He told himself he needed the money. He told himself she hadn't done anything to hurt him. And so he went on pretending. Yet each night as he lay in bed below the attic, he could hear her whispering to the darkness above. Not words anymore, just soft hums, deep and low, like an old lullaby sung in reverse. And for the first time since he'd taken the money and said the vows, Elijah Graves began to feel truly afraid. Elijah had seen war, famine, drought, and death, but nothing prepared him for the cold dread that Annabelle's words left in the air. She stood at the top of the attic stairs, shrouded in darkness, her bonnet still tied neatly beneath her chin as if it were part of her skin now. Her voice had no inflection, just wait. You must not look at me after midnight. Ever. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a warning. It felt like a rule that had been carved into stone long before Elijah had been born. He blinked, unsure whether he should laugh, nod, or question her sanity. But the gravity in her tone anchored him still. So he agreed half-heartedly. All right, he mumbled, scratching the back of his neck. Whatever you say, miss. That first night he stayed obedient. Midnight came and went, and he kept his eyes shut, fists clenched beneath his pillow as he listened to the wind groan through the rafters. He told himself she was just strange. Maybe from a foreign land. Maybe carrying grief too heavy for words. He'd seen women act broken after the war, after losing their babies, husbands, or homes. Maybe she was one of them. But by the fifth night, something began to gnaw at his curiosity. It started subtly. A soft creaking sound above his room. Not like mice or settling wood. No, these were deliberate footsteps, paced and uneven like someone limping. Then came the weeping. Soft, muffled, restrained, as though she was trying not to be heard, but the house was too old to keep secrets. Each night the sounds got louder, closer. He tried stuffing cotton into his ears. Didn't help. One night he swore he heard humming, a lullaby maybe, sung in a voice that sounded half woman, half something else. By the eighth night, Elijah could no longer take it. The clock on the mantel ticked past midnight. He lay still, chest rising and falling like a trapped animal, trying to ignore the creak, creak, creak above him. Then the crying. Then, something new. A dragging sound, like fabric trailing behind someone across the wooden attic floor. He couldn't take it anymore. Curiosity, that damn vice, gripped his spine. He slipped from his bed, careful not to make the floor groan. The lantern in his hand flickered with every heartbeat. As he ascended the stairs toward the attic, each step seemed colder than the last. A chill climbed his bare feet and into his bones. When he reached the landing he paused. Her weeping had stopped. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. A sliver of flickering candlelight spilled through the gap. Elijah leaned forward, barely breathing. Through the slit he saw her silhouette. She was standing near the window, or rather hovering slightly above the wooden floor. Her back was turned to him, her arms slack at her sides. But her shadow on the floor, it didn't match her body. The lantern shook in his hand. Where her body looked frail and straight, the shadow curled unnaturally. Her arms in the shadow were long, too long, stretching down past her knees, ending in spindly fingers that twitched and twitched again, like something searching blindly in the dark. Her neck in the shadow was crooked, bent to the left as if broken. And the legs, the shadow had four of them. Elijah's breath hitched. A cold sweat broke across his brow. He blinked rapidly, convinced his eyes were playing tricks. But then she turned. Not fully, just her head, slow and creaking like the hinges on a crypt door. And even though he couldn't see her face beneath the bonnet, he knew she was looking right at him. Elijah, she whispered. He stumbled back from the door, nearly dropping the lantern. The flame flickered violently as his back hit the stair railing. He clutched it tight, afraid to turn his back, afraid to blink. The door creaked wider. But Annabelle didn't move. Her silhouette now slanted, crooked and contorted, like someone balancing on broken limbs. That humming returned, low and guttural this time, like a dirge sung from beneath the earth. Elijah ran. He bounded down the stairs 2 steps at a time, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't stop until he slammed the door to his bedroom shut, dropped the lantern and pressed his back to the wall, chest heaving. The house went silent. No creaking. No weeping. Just the howl of wind outside, and the soft tick of the mantel clock. 1:17 a.m. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of the room, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the door. And in the dead stillness, he replayed her words again and again. You must not look at me after midnight. The next morning, Annabelle stood in the kitchen like nothing had happened. Her bonnet still on, her hands neatly folded. She offered him coffee in that same flat voice. No mention of the night. No hint of anything unusual. He looked at her, trembling. What are you? Her head tilted ever so slightly. You promised not to ask questions, she said, voice almost sad. Elijah wanted to run. Leave the ranch, the marriage, the money. But something, perhaps pride, perhaps fear, rooted him to the spot. The woman, whatever she was, had entered his life under the guise of desperation. And he'd accepted her blindly. Now he wasn't sure if he'd married a woman, a ghost, or something far worse. Elijah Graves had never been a man given to paranoia. Life on the frontier demanded a certain level-headedness. Droughts, cattle thieves, government men with their papers and taxes, there was always something to wrestle with. But ever since Annabelle arrived, he'd been wrestling shadows and worse things he couldn't name. And now, with $500 in his pocket and a woman in his attic who refused to show her face after sundown, Elijah was coming apart like rotten wood beneath booth heels. He hadn't slept properly in days. The midnight weeping still came, regular as the crow of dawn. Some nights it was soft and mournful, others it twisted into fits of choking, animal-like wails that turned his marrow cold. He had stopped climbing the stairs. He hadn't looked again. But curiosity had begun its slow rot inside him. By day she was quiet, obedient even. She'd sweep the floors, boil water, patch a rip in his shirt if he left it on the chair. But she never took meals with him. Never spoke unless spoken to. And never ever took off that bonnet. The town of Dustmere wasn't a place for gossips, but Elijah figured someone had to know something. So one hot, amber-lit afternoon, he saddled up and rode into town, making his way straight to the archives housed in the old schoolhouse-turned-town hall. A dusty clerk, probably older than the floorboards, raised an eyebrow at the request but complied. Annabelle? The man muttered, running a gnarled finger across the brittle pages of birth records, death registers and marriage logs. What's the surname? Don't got one, Elijah answered truthfully. Just Annabelle. The man paused. Ain't no Annabelle born in this county for the last 40 years, he said flatly. Not unless she came here from somewhere else. You married to a ghost, Cowboy? Elijah didn't laugh. His eyes stayed on the yellowed paper. He left the clerk behind and headed toward the edge of town. There, in the shadow of the old chapel, sat Widow Mallory. Folks called her a witch, but mostly because she spoke truths people didn't want to hear. Her eyes were milky with age, but her voice was sharp as shattered glass. When Elijah asked about women who wore bonnets that never came off, her face went grim. Some brides wear bonnets not for modesty, she whispered, but to keep what's inside from slipping out. Elijah blinked. What does that mean? She leaned in. Means you're not married to anything the Lord recognizes. You best pray it's only your soul she's after. He rode back to the ranch with the words stuck like thorns in his mind. By the time he reached home, the moon had risen fat and pale behind the clouds. He dismounted slowly, the weight of dread in his limbs. He saw the attic window, her window, shuttered tight with that same black cloth she'd nailed over every pane. He entered the house quietly. The air inside was cold, far too cold for summer. His boots echoed against the floorboards. Somewhere upstairs the floor creaked softly. He climbed. The stairs moaned under his weight as if protesting what he was about to do. He carried no lantern this time. The hallway was dim, but the moonlight through the cracks in the attic door gave enough glow. He reached her door and knocked. Nothing. Elijah, came her voice, soft as wind through willows. He swallowed. I need to see your face. A long silence. Then, no you don't. His hand trembled as he reached for the latch. I can't live with shadows. I need the truth. Elijah, please. Her voice broke. You won't understand. You'll collapse under the weight of it. But he had to know. He opened the door. She was sitting in the center of the room, the moonlight catching on her bonnet like a halo made of shadow. Her hands were folded in her lap, still, demure. But her back was too straight, her limbs too long, elbows bent at impossible angles under the modest cotton of her dress. "Take it off," he said hoarsely. Annabelle didn't move. "Once you see me you can't unsee. You won't be able to close your eyes without remembering." "Take it off," he said again, barely a whisper. And she did. With one gloved hand she untied the ribbon beneath her chin. The bonnet drooped. Then, slowly she lifted it from her head. Elijah didn't scream. He simply dropped to his knees like the bones had melted clean out of him. His eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat, and the room tilted sideways. He collapsed. What he saw wasn't a woman. Not entirely. There were features, yes, eyes where eyes should be, a mouth that moved though too wide, too deep, but everything was wrong. Distorted. As if her face had been sculpted by a blind man who'd only heard what humans looked like in passing. Her skin shimmered faintly, not with beauty but with something unnatural, like oil on water. Her eyes were too large, lidless and luminous, and they blinked not up and down but sideways. "Elijah," she whispered, kneeling beside him. He could barely focus. His heartbeat was a wild animal in his chest. Her touch was icy. "I didn't want you to see. I wanted to stay hidden, to be safe. But now..." Darkness overtook him. Not sleep, not death, something else. Something colder. The last thing he heard before everything went black was her voice, soft and mournful. "I warned you." Elijah's eyes fluttered open just before dawn, his breath ragged, clothes soaked in cold sweat. The image from the attic still clung to his mind like cobwebs on skin, sticky, disorienting, impossible to brush away. He sat upright in bed, the mattress creaking beneath him, and tried to piece reality together. But reality had twisted. It had warped into something cruel and incomprehensible the moment Annabelle removed her bonnet. What he had seen wasn't just a face, it was a collection of them. Her pale skin looked paper-thin, stretched like raw hide across a structure that defied human design. Eyes blinked where there shouldn't be eyes, some open sideways, others too wide or too small. One mouth near her cheek had whispered something. He didn't know what, only that the words traveled in reverse, slipping into his ear like water draining backward into a well. Her main face, if it could even be called that, seemed stitched together from sorrow, lips trembling, not with fear, but with pity. "You weren't supposed to look," she had said in a voice that made no sound, yet filled the room. Her mouth moved but the sound came from behind him, around him, inside him. "But now you belong here too." He'd fainted right there, knees buckling like they'd been shot out from under him. And now, hours later, as the pale pink light of morning began to leak through the boarded windows, Elijah realized something else had changed. The attic door, once bolted and sealed by Annabelle's insistence, stood ajar. He climbed the steps, barefoot and hesitant, each creak of the wooden stair echoing longer than it should, as if the house had grown hollow, cavernous inside. The air felt heavier with each step. The door hadn't just been opened. It had been inviting. The attic looked different now. Gone were the simple furnishings and black curtains. The room was cavernous, impossibly vast for the dimensions of the house. Walls sloped at unnatural angles, the floor warped like it had been warped by heat or something older. Objects floated, tiny ones like nails, scissors and bits of thread, hovering near the ceiling as if gravity had lost its hold. Annabelle stood at the center, barefoot, eyes calm and blank. The bonnet was gone. Elijah tried not to stare, tried to fix his gaze on anything else, but even her silhouette was disturbing. She wasn't breathing. She wasn't even blinking. "You feel it, don't you?" she whispered. Elijah opened his mouth but found no voice. "This place doesn't let go," she continued, stepping toward him. "You brought me back to your home and now it's not just mine. It's ours." He stepped backward and turned, racing down the stairs two at a time. He had to leave. Whatever he had accepted in that church, whatever contract he had unknowingly signed when he'd taken that $500, it was unraveling fast. He needed his horse, needed to put miles between himself and whatever was nesting in his attic. He burst through the front door, the morning sun glaring and warm, and untied his horse with trembling hands. He mounted quickly, kicked the reins, and didn't look back. He rode fast, over the open plains, past the crooked fence posts, past the dead trees that lined his boundary. He didn't stop until the landscape changed, until the hills were new and the wind felt unfamiliar. But then he saw it, the wooden porch, the chipped red door, the same bent weather vane. It was his ranch. He was home. "No," he whispered, spinning the horse again. He didn't question the direction, only the escape. He rode again, even harder this time. He followed the trail along the creek, through the birch grove, out toward the township road. And once more the ranch returned. The porch, the windmill, the silence. Each time he left, no matter how far or in what direction, the world seemed to bend behind him, folding like paper to push him back. It was as if the road itself had grown roots and wound back toward the house. He was trapped, not just in place but in something worse, intention. Inside, the house was changing too. The mirrors had turned dark, not just dusty but absorbing light. He found his own reflection refusing to mimic him, moving slightly out of sync. The clock hands ticked backward. The kettle whistled though it hadn't been touched. Annabelle no longer appeared only at night. She moved through the house in daylight now, barefoot, humming strange lullabies with no melody. She didn't blink. She never ate. Her presence wasn't aggressive, but it was consuming. Like the air itself bent around her, submitting. Elijah tried to write, to remember the dates, to track how long he'd been trapped. But his papers always vanished the next morning, replaced by blank sheets. The ink in his pen dried within minutes. Time had broken. And yet he still slept. He still woke. Something in the cycle persisted. One night, while hiding in the barn, Elijah found the soft-spoken man in black waiting for him, sitting on a bale of hay as if nothing strange had ever occurred. His hat cast a shadow over his smile, and his voice was gentle as ever. "I see you peeked," the man said. "That's unfortunate." "What is she?" Elijah rasped. "She's what's left when someone makes a deal too heavy for a single soul. All debts go somewhere, Cowboy. You just agreed to hold hers." "I didn't know." "You didn't ask." The man's smile never faded. "But that's the beauty of choice. We never need to know. We just need to sign." With that, the man in black stood, tipped his hat, and walked straight through the barn wall as if it were made of smoke. Elijah didn't follow. He couldn't. He understood now. The house wasn't haunted. It was the haunt. And he was part of it. They call it Widow's Hollow now, a place travelers avoid after sundown. Locals whisper of the cursed ranch tucked beyond the dry ridge, where wild dogs won't tread and compasses spin uselessly. What was once Elijah Graves' home is now sunken with time, its paint long peeled, its roof sagging like a tired sigh. And yet if you pass by, especially at dusk, you'll see them. Two figures on the porch. A man in a hat pulled low, unmoving, eyes vacant like old glass. And beside him, a veiled woman, still as death, always facing the road. Years had slipped past like dust in the wind since Elijah's name was last spoken in town. Folks stopped asking questions after his barn collapsed with no storm, after his cattle were found facing the woods, eyes wide in terror. After the sheriff who rode out there came back a week later with a white streak in his hair and a stammer no preacher could fix. People learned to forget. But the ranch remained, suspended in some kind of waiting. One evening, just as the sun bled over the hills, a stranger arrived in the nearby town of Larkspur Junction. He was lean, dirt-bitten, and young, too young to already carry the kind of weariness he did in his eyes. He asked for water, then for work. But the saloon keeper only offered a look. "Work's hard to come by," he said. "But sometimes, offers find you." And find him it did. Later that night, alone by the hearth, the young man heard footsteps not his own. A chair creaked. Then a voice, low, polished, slow like molasses but cold like the barrel of a winter rifle. "You look like you need money," the voice said. The man in black stepped from the shadows of the room, immaculate despite the dust of the town. He wore no hat, no gun, but held an envelope between two gloved fingers. The boy hesitated. "Who are you?" "I offer arrangements," the man said. $500 for a simple task. You marry a woman. She's quiet. She needs a place to stay. That's all." The boy laughed nervously, thinking it a joke. "Ain't no woman would marry me sight unseen." "She already agreed," said the man. "All she needs is someone, a human. Just long enough." "Long enough for what?" The man in black did not answer. He simply laid the envelope on the table. "Sundown tomorrow. Take her hand. Say the words. No questions asked." He paused, his voice dipping like thunder far off. "She needs a husband. The last one broke." The air thickened as if the room had suddenly sunk beneath a heavy lake. The boy opened the envelope and saw real bills, old but crisp. Enough to buy his mama a proper burial. Enough to ride east. Enough to matter. Some part of him, the part untouched by hardship and not yet bruised by compromise, told him to run. But poverty has a way of quieting conscience. He accepted. As the man in black stood to leave, he adjusted his cuff and looked toward the cracked mirror on the saloon wall. His reflection didn't follow. "Be ready," he said. "She hates waiting." By morning, The boy stood in the same decrepit church Elijah had once occupied. The same priest, though older, gaunter, stood before him, eyes dim and distant. The pews were empty. A chill crept across the floor. Then came the soft rustle of fabric. The bride walked in. She was veiled in a bonnet, hands clasped tight. Not a word passed her lips. The boy swallowed hard. Something deep inside him, the place where instinct resides, older than reason, screamed. But his hands didn't listen. They were married by noon. At sunset, two new shadows appeared on the front porch of the ranch. One tall, stiff. The other slight and still. Travelers who pass say they never see them move. But each time someone rides by, the man seems a little more hollow. His shoulders droop lower. His boots collect more dust. His eyes lose more light. The woman, though, she never ages. Never speaks. Just waits. And far off, in another town already beginning to forget the one before it, the man in black enters another saloon. Another desperate soul. Another offer. Because the house always needs a husband. The wind howled louder than usual that night, clawing at the warped wooden siding of the ranch house like it was trying to dig something out. In the attic, the veil stirred in the darkness where Annabelle, or whatever she truly was, sat humming an off-key lullaby to no one in particular. Elijah, or what was left of him, sat on the front porch in his rocker, staring blankly into the night. He didn't blink anymore. Didn't eat. Didn't age. Just rocked as if the rhythm held him together. The townsfolk had stopped coming long ago. The trail leading to the ranch had vanished, like it had been swallowed by the earth itself. The house had become more myth than memory, a ghost whispered about over campfires and in drunken conversations at backwater saloons. Still, every few years someone would stumble upon it, or be led to it. It was just before sunset when a young man named Jonas, desperate and broke, rode his mule through an unfamiliar canyon, swearing. He'd never seen this stretch before despite having ridden this land for years. There at the canyon mouth stood the man in black, untouched by dust, his boots polished like fresh stone, eyes hidden under the brim of a wide hat. $500, he said before Jonas could ask a thing. All you gotta do is marry her. She's quiet. Don't eat much. But she needs protection. Jonas hesitated. But the money was more than he'd seen in months. And something in the man's tone, calm, commanding, made it feel less like a question and more like a certainty. As Jonas followed him down the narrowing trail, the sun dipped beneath the ridge and the land fell quiet. Not the usual hush of dusk, but a dead silence. No crickets. No wind. Not even the whisper of his mule's hooves in the dirt. At the end of the trail, the house stood crooked, wrapped in shadows. On the porch sat a man with hollow eyes and a woman in a veil, her hands folded in her lap as if she'd been waiting. "She's yours now," said the man in black, pressing the money into Jonas's hand. "Same rules apply. You mustn't ask questions. And you mustn't look after midnight." Jonas looked at the veiled woman. She stood slowly with a graceful, eerie precision. Without speaking, she offered him her gloved hand. The man on the porch didn't flinch. His eyes just followed. The next morning Jonas was gone. His mule wandered into town alone days later with the saddle still cinched and a boot dangling from one stirrup. Folks shook their heads. "Desert'll take your mind," they said. "Or worse, your soul." Back at the ranch, in the attic where time twisted and air stood still, the woman in the veil whispered a name into the floorboards. Not Annabelle. Not anything human. A name old as bone and dark as burial dirt, a name never meant to be spoken aloud. Elijah, deep in his frozen stare, mouthed it slowly as if remembering something he had never learned. And far beneath the foundation of the ranch, something opened its eyes for the first time in 100 years. The man in black walked the long trail alone, the same way he always had, humming a broken hymn. Behind him, the earth closed in over the path, erasing his footprints like the story was never meant to be told, only repeated. And on certain nights, if the wind is just right, travelers claim to hear faint whispers near the canyon's mouth. A man weeping, a woman humming, and a name no living thing should know. The end isn't when you die. It's when you belong. And if you see a ranch with black cloth nailed to every window, ride the other way.